Hello, hello, and welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. It's June 15th here in California and June 16th in Tokyo in Japan. I'm Ulrike Schaede. I'm the professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego and director of JFIT. JFIT is our Japan Center at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. GPS is an international relations / public policy school. We have several programs with a focus on the Pacific Rim, including a Masters of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If that's of interest, please visit gps.ucsd.edu for more information on our programs. And JFIT is our Japan Center, and the website for JFIT is jfit.ucsd.edu. If you go there, you can find under news and media information on our San Diego Japan newsflash, which is a bi-weekly mailer, and also right next to it, the Japan Zoominars tab, where you can follow our past and upcoming Zoominar events if you don't want to follow us on LinkedIn or Twitter, which you can also do. Or if that's all too complicated, just go to thejapanologist.com, which is my own website. So the Zoominar is a weekly event. And of course, today we're going to talk about Japan's role in shaping the liberal trading order. But let me just point out to you that we're not at all done for the year, even though it's now summer. Next week, we'll have Bob Eberhardt to talk about the myth about Japanese entrepreneurship. And then on June 29th, we'll have Alisa Friedman talking about women in Japanese society. She's a pop culture and gender specialist and has just written a very interesting paper on KonMari, Marie Kondo. And it's hilarious to have somebody who knows what they're doing analyze what KonMari did to the world. Then we'll have Kenshi Busawa, Believe It or Not, A New Era for Japan. And then we'll have Ashley Brown talking about sustainable architecture, and Dave Lahaney on July 20th talking about the politics of everything, including the Olympics. So stay tuned. Our Zoominars are recorded, and you can find past events on our website. Today, if you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to type in these questions to the Q&A box. If I call on you, I will refer to you only by your first name to secure and protect your privacy. All right, and so before I introduce Mireya Solis, let me just point out her writings. And there are more than 50 publications under her name, including these 4 books, Banking on Multinationals, which was her first big work showing or explaining industrial policy that was outward bound. And that is actually of new relevance today, and with the Toshiba case and all kinds of other things going on. She then turned to competitive regionalism and cross-regional trade agreements, all the way to her 2017 book, Dilemmas of a Trading Nation, which won the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize in 2017. And that's not all she's doing. At Brookings, she's writing policy pieces, and I want to in particular guide your attention to her piece in Foreign Affairs last November, December, The Underappreciated Power, which is just absolutely a fantastic piece of research and policy insight. So let me stop my share and introduce our speaker today. Here she is, Dr. Mireya Solis. Welcome to the Japan Zoominar.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So let me give people, most of our audience will know you, but let me just be complete and explain who you are. So Mireya Solis is the director of the Center for East Asian Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, and also the Knight Chair in Japan Studies at Brookings. And you might wonder, what does Phil Knight have to do with Japan? And just as an aside, the very first Nike sneaker was actually modeled and licensed from Onitsuka Tiger sneakers, which is today's ASICS. And of course, today ASICS and Nike are head-on competitors, but Phil Knight still has a soft spot in his heart for Japan and Japanese technology. Anyway, back to Mireya. Before 2012, when she joined Brookings, she was professor of political of politics with tenure at first Brandeis and then American University. And by way of education, her BA in International Relations is from Colegio de Mexico, I should say. And her MA and PhD are from Harvard University, Department of Government. So 50 publications, as I already told you just now, on trade, FDI, the Japanese state and multinationals, FDA, NAFTA, and foreign policy in Japan and the world are all super interesting. So if you haven't read her work, you might want to go and look up some of those books, which are also propped up there behind me. So with that, Mireya, it's great to have you. Our topic today will be your work. And it's an interesting thing, right? For the last 20 years, we've been celebrating a global opening and trade and GATT and the WTO and the global trade order. But currently we're in a little bit of a crisis. The rise of China has thrown things a little bit out of whack. And some of the Western states, including the United States, have lost their faith in globalization. So what we want to talk about today is how Japan fits into all of this, right? So in the past, in terms of shaping the global order as well as going forward. So you've written about this. So why don't we start out with you giving us your view on Japan's role in shaping the trade order?
Thank you very much, Ulrike, for that very generous introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. I know that this is a very active platform that you have created. So I'm delighted to be contributing some of my insights, after so many years of watching these developments. And I think it's really exciting because what we've seen is a transformation of Japan. And that's what I tried to capture with the title of Follower No More. And, just to tee up a little bit of the discussion that we're going to have today, and of course, it comes in the midst of crisis, a crisis of globalization, a redefinition of US leadership, the rise of a new power in Asia with China. What does all this mean for Japan? What I would like to start first with is just by laying out in which ways I would argue that Japan actually is no longer a follower, but a leader, just to give a sense of how much this transformation has, the high levels of transformation that we're talking about. And very simply, that Japan has become a champion of rules-based trade. Then when you think about China's Belt and Road Initiative, and we know that industrialized countries are thinking a lot about that the G7, Japan is a peer competitor of China on this front. No other industrialized country comes close. And last but not least, I think that we see a lot of conceptual innovations, a lot of diplomatic heft coming from Japan that we were not used to. Japan has innovated with the free and open Indo-Pacific, has been an early champion of the Quad, and those have become referent points for the United States in its approach to Asia. So Japan actually has become an indispensable partner for the United States when it thinks about this priority area. So let me just tell you a little bit briefly about why these three elements I think are so important to understand Japan's role today in global affairs, in economic governance, in thinking about US-Asia policy. First of all, when we think about Japan as a leader of free trade, that was not the way we used to think about Japan. We used to think of Japan as defensive, reactive, inward-looking. And Japan, certainly has reinvented itself because it's responding to a much more challenging international environment. You have a stagnation of the multilateral trading system, the World Trade Organization. You have US-China rivalry, and the economic game is central to that rivalry. And we've seen it manifested in trade wars, in tech restrictions. And of course, we have the pandemic and all of the disruptions that has brought about and the rise of economic nationalism, quite frankly. But I also think, Ulrike, that it's very important to keep in mind that if Japan is becoming more proactive, it's because it has suffered or experienced an internal transformation as well, and that this has been decades in the making. To cover a lot of ground very quickly, I think that what's most important in thinking about why Japan is capable now of being proactive, we have to think about the rise of executive leadership because of electoral and administrative reforms. We have to think about the weakening power of vested interests that used to be very influential and keeping Japan out of big league trade negotiations and thinking agriculture. We have to think about something that you have written a lot about, Ulrike, the global value chain, an important role that Japanese companies play there, and therefore the outward orientation that comes from that. And then political stability coming from the Prime Minister's office, and therefore the ability to be strategic and to think about long term. So, Japan has reinvented itself. At the beginning of the 21st century, Japan really had no major trade agreement under its belt. Today, it has 21 such trade agreements, which cover almost 80% of its trade volume. But I would make the case that not every trade agreement is created equal. And if there is one trade agreement that has been central to Japan's transformation, is a Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. And I would make the point, Ulrike, that people have been making the wrong bets about Japan and the TPP for a very long time. When Japan was first considering joining the TPP, there was a lot of reluctance to see this happen in Washington. A lot of people were making the case that Japan would slow things down, that it will never come to a fruition, that Japan would lower the ambition of the trade agreement. And they were proven wrong because Japan actually came with a unified voice and a degree of ambition we had not seen before. And then people also got Japan wrong when they assumed that once the United States left the trade agreement, the TPP, that the whole thing would collapse. And actually Japan, working with other 10 countries, resuscitated the TPP into what we now call, in a not a very elegant acronym, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP. And since then, it has been now an agreement with the European Union, and more recently a 15-nation trade grouping in East Asia, what we refer to as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And there you go, Japan is part of the 3 largest trade deals in the world. Who would have thought when you and I were in grad school that Japan would be a maker of mega trade agreements? And I can say more about the Belt and Road Initiative and about the Quad and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, but that's just, I think, a set of comments to give some texture as to how profound this transformation has been.
Great, thank you very much. So let's jump into the discussion, and I want to encourage the audience to type in your questions into the Q&A button there, and I'll try to weave your questions into our conversation. So one of the, so your most recent book is about the dilemmas of a trading nation. And it's about the domestic, a large portion of that is actually about the domestic interests, right? So the power of the agricultural, the vested interest, the GA, the Japan Agricultural Association, but also the struggles of the domestic policy setup and the role of METI and so forth. Can you talk a little bit more about the changes that happened within Japan that led to this new role of Japan as an engine of many of these trade agreements? What's different now that from the 1980s, say?
Thank you. And I think it's important to lay out that these have been long-term structural changes in the political economy of Japan. And therefore, it's important to know that because people have questions about what happens next. And at least a lot of that structure is in place. And I think that gives us greater confidence that Japan is not going to go back to its old ways. So, Japan, everybody knows that had a very strong agricultural lobby with a lot of political clout that basically exercised veto power over trade negotiations. And there were a couple of no-nos. And obviously there were extremely sensitive commodities that were completely off limits, rice first and foremost amongst them. But then negotiations with any large agricultural exporter was something that the agricultural lobby would successfully veto. But the JA has suffered changes. In terms of its membership, there's been a lot of demographic change in Japan, urbanization, the aging of farmers, and that has also resulted in some weakening cloud, changes in electoral rules that made the JA voice less powerful than it had been amongst Japanese politicians. And the fact that you now began to see the articulation from business interests who were suffering from discrimination because everybody else was negotiating preferential trade agreements and Japan was the laggard. And therefore, they were concerned that they were going to lose market access. So you have this countervailing set of economic interests as one important dynamic. Another one, anybody that works on Japan understands that bureaucratic sectionalism is legendary, and therefore the image you have is that Japan would not come with one voice to a negotiation table. It would not just be the U.S. and Japan facing each other across the table, but that actually there would be a very large Japanese delegation representing different bureaucracies who would have different views on the merits of the trade agreement, the trade-offs that would be made to close that trade negotiation, and the lack, therefore, of coordinating mechanisms to make sure that these bureaucracies had integrated their views and that Japan could present that set of positions in international negotiation. So what we saw as executive leadership increased in Japan was that the Kante, the Prime Minister's office, became more of a control tower. And one very important development in the TPP was the creation of a TPP headquarters. The first time ever that Japan actually had approached a trade negotiation like that, where you had elite bureaucrats, 50 bureaucrats or so, that came not to represent their ministry, but to represent Japan. And I think that made a lot of difference. But also, it's true that the book looks a lot at domestic political dynamics and that the TPP was important to give some credibility to Prime Minister Abe's reform program, but there's always a very large foreign policy component to it. And therefore, the desire to put behind the period of friction with the United States, anchor both Japan and the United States to a regional architecture when everybody's aware of a power shift in Asia taking place. It was both. It was the reallocation of vested interest, the institutional changes to the negotiation setup, and the keen awareness that the neighborhood is changing. And if you don't step up, someone else is going to eat your lunch.
So when people hear trade, they think exports. And exports have actually jumped up and down a little bit. I think when you were writing your book, it was actually pretty on a downward trend and contributing less than 15% to GDP, but they're up now again to 20% of GDP. But still, exports are only one part of the story, right? The other part of the story is that, especially going back to your first book, is a huge FDI, outward bound FDI from Japan, which has accumulated to very large Japanese production plants peppered around the world, actually. So to what extent are Japan's trade efforts bound or oriented towards protecting these assets, right? So that would be my thing, right? So Japan's role in the global supply chain also means that Japan has a production network. So Japanese companies own plants around the world. And I always thought of Japan's interest in foreign policy also as making sure that these won't be expropriated, that we're friends with all of these countries where we have all of these plans. Can you talk a little bit about that motivation?
Sure, and I think that's a key development. And basically, outward investment or FDI and trade are now joined at the hip. They're part of the same flow of economic activity, and that's what really embodies the global supply chain. Sorry, my dog. So, when you think about trade, a lot of people, as you say, think about exports, and it seems like we are mercantilists and we can only think about trade if we are sending goods abroad, but that's not the reality of how international trade works anymore. And therefore, what this created for Japan was a very big incentive to negotiate deep trade agreements that have these provisions that protect intellectual property assets, that protect against expropriation, that facilitate services, which have now become essential to the operation of these complex supply networks. And it is those deep trade agreements like the TPP that provide that kind of institutions and norms and disciplines that enable the operation of the supply chain. So, it's interesting, Ulrike, because before the TPP, Japan had been negotiating smaller trade agreements, still very defensively, still keeping the agricultural market closed. And therefore, it was not getting the kind of opening on those deeper provisions that it required for the supply chain. And therefore, I think that's why the TPP was a truly qualitative change for Japan that made sense in terms of the very large foreign production wages in some industries like transportation, electronics, and so forth. You need to provide that regional framework for those supply chains to operate effectively.
So you mentioned intellectual property protection, and actually Robbie has a question around that, which is, how is technology changing trade patterns and trade policy? For example, in energy, agriculture, autos. So how is that part of the story? The old Japan was exporting, television sets. The new Japan is providing the global supply chain with deep technology, right? That's a fundamentally different trade thing. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I actually feel that you're the best person to talk about that because that's what you've been doing work on. But clearly, technological change has altered the way in which these economies operate, and therefore it has altered the lines of comparative advantage. It has altered the way in which companies and industries think about the international division of labor. There are many ways to get at this question, and the one that you have highlighted a lot is that Japan has really core competencies on, the inputs, the components, the production machinery, not so much the consumer product, right? And that's very important because sometimes I find, probably you do, that people dismiss Japan because they don't see the brand of Japanese companies in the product that they purchase. So that's one way to look at the role of technology, and that's more on your side of the court than mine. But there are others. One is, for example, when you think about, we started this conversation talking about the backlash against globalization. Well, the thing is that, when we think about jobs, it's not just, adjustment to opening markets that's important. It is also that technologies are changing the nature of jobs, the composition of jobs, the skill sets that are required. And a lot of that backlash, especially in the United States, and we are fixated with the China shock argument, is that it is all about trade. And unfortunately, a lot of the policies in the United States are built around that notion, and therefore people talk about trade adjustment assistance, when what we need is a broader set of safety net policies that allow people to recuperate from setbacks, regardless of where they happen, because the factory went and just installed robots everywhere, or the factory moved to a different country. So again, I think that we end up being with tunnel vision when we talk about trade and don't see the larger forces of economic change. There's one more way in which technology enters this conversation, and I'm jumping around just to try to showcase how important this topic is, and that, it's central to US-China strategic competition. And, there's a lot of back and forth. The United States now has imposed a number of tech restrictions on semiconductors. And there's a lot of discussion in the United States about reforming the export control regime. and try to avoid adversaries to acquire what we refer to as emerging technologies, what those technologies are, what is the boundary. Those are issues that are being defined and redefined as we speak, but they're also approached now with a larger sense of a strategic competition. So I think that I started talking about how Japan has become a leader on free trade, on infrastructure investment, and so forth. But it's very important to understand that we are at the critical moment, I believe, when interstate competition is redefining the way in which we have thought about economic relationships. And more we see defensive measures, what we refer to as economic security, because we are trying to avoid the competitor to get the lead on these technologies that will define competitiveness, productivity, and national power.
So while we're at this, so we're getting a lot of questions on China and on what's happening in Washington, but let's stay on this topic for a moment. I think actually Adam Posen has an interesting piece in Foreign Affairs on this misunderstanding of what trade actually can and cannot do in helping America out of its troubles and job losses, because there's also the digital transformation and jobs are going to go away no matter what our trade regime is. But what I would like to hear you on is this 2018 law that I think is called FIRMA, the foreign investment allowance, I guess, re-innovation law or something, which basically set the level at 10% for foreign investment that can come into the United States without having to be allowed by the US government. And that was really targeted at China, but in order not to be so discriminatory, it was actually a blanket thing, which means that if a Japanese company wants to invest in a Silicon Valley venture, a startup company, they need to get an allowance from the government, which is a paper thing, but still has to go through the hoops, I guess. And then, of course, in reaction to this, companies like Germany and Japan, which are actually, otherwise quite open, changed their foreign trade laws in a similar way, so that they now too actually will have some sort of admin process of guiding these foreign direct investments that come into the country. Is this are we on a slippery slope back to this tit for tat trading and beggar thy neighbor, or whatever we called those 100 years ago? Are we going backwards here, where we're saying, no, you cannot invest in our company or in our technology, out of a sort of a reawakening of protectionism?
I think that's a critical question, and it touches on the broader question of economic security, and it's a number of things. It's the tightening of export controls, is the screening of foreign direct investment, which is what you're referring to, based on national security considerations, greater surveillance or tracking foreign funding for research institutions, thinking about, inviting or not inviting foreign students and having them access, if they have access or not to labs that have sensitive technology. It's the whole thing, and it's happening right in front of our eyes. And part of it, it is indeed motivated by deep concerns that China has been taking advantage of a very open system, and that some critical technology has left the United States this way. But the concern, though, is that you have to be very nuanced and careful in the way in which you devise these policies, because I think that the risk is that we end up overcorrecting, and that this then stifles innovation and stifles productivity, and that it triggers an incentive for other countries to follow suit. And national security is articulated, it's invoked, and therefore a whole set of economic transactions now suddenly become off limits. So, when the United States tightened its foreign screening of foreign direct investment, other countries follow suit. It's not just the United States, it's Australia, Japan also has changed its foreign exchange and foreign trade law to introduce now more control over the type of acquisitions that takes place. And I know that in Japan, this has generated a lot of discussion because it has been a long-standing goal of the Japanese government to bring more foreign direct investment. And where this would actually counter that, because it's harder sometimes to then clear that screening. This is very early days. We don't know yet how these mechanisms, as they're being developed, are going to operate, whether they'll actually discourage foreign direct investment to a significant degree or not, whether they're actually targeting sufficiently to avoid the theft of intellectual property. It's just beginning to happen. But I think that the fact is that in addition to that, we have seen recently the United States and China go at the tariff war that was waged on the outside of the WTO. And therefore, it just becomes to one more element undermining what we have conceived as a multilateral rules-based order. Because again, in this situation where the United States and China see each other as adversaries or rivals, then it's very easy to have this slippery slope of economic defensive measures.
So we have two questions on Japan and China, and I'm going to lay them both out. So Hiroki wonders whether there's any way for Japan to help, right, to guide China to the direction of pro-reform and being a responsible player for international cooperation, because Japan is gaining some power. Japan is important also for China. China needs Japan for the reasons we just talked about, the inputs of deep technologies into the things that China then assembles and produces. And until China knows how to make these things itself, which will in some areas will take a few more years, China is dependent on Japan. So is there a way for Japan to actually be a sort of an older brother of sorts and help make things for the better? And Perry wonders how much of the change in Japan's behavior vis-a-vis participating in these TPP and Quad and all of the things that you mentioned in your intro remarks are attributable to Japan's desire to hold China in check. So is this a larger strategy of Japan saying, whoa, yeah, right now we're important in Asia, but we're kind of tiny obviously compared to China. So let's make friends with Australia and the UK and of course the EU, and the US is a little bit wobbly right now, but so let's make friends with everybody else so that we can we have friends and we're not alone.
Those are great questions. Whether Japan can provide reforms for China, incentives for China to reform, it's a hard question, because I actually don't see in the past few years strong appetite from the Chinese leadership to embrace once again some type of market-oriented reform. I think that the trend is working in the opposite direction. And what we've seen is actually a recommitment to state capitalist model, and a desire of China to provide regional integration institutions that, of course, weave the region closer together, but that are fully compatible with Chinese standards for that integration. So, the Digital Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, even if it was not driven by China, nevertheless, the outcomes are very favorable to China, because basically it blunts the narrative that the world is decoupling from China. China is part of the largest trade agreement in the world. And China was able to obtain, significant market access to Japan, first preferential term access to the Japanese market, and therefore had gains to be made. And China did not have to surrender its industrial policy to achieve that. For example, there is a digital economy agreement chapter in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and it received a lot of discussion that China was willing to entertain language on freedom of data flows. But when you actually read what's in the agreement, first of all, it's not subject to dispute settlement, that chapter. And there's a very wide national security exemption that countries can invoke to evade the commitments. So I think that China has its own game, and I think it obeys to its own logic, both because of domestic politics and because of the geopolitical situation. Having said that, I do think that Japan has played a smarter game on how to deal with the China challenge. I think if there's one lesson that the United States has learned painfully, is that a unilateral route and the use of the tariff as the main way in which you try to punish China to change its ways is ineffective. You look at that phase one US-China agreement, and there were very large purchase commitments, but China has not delivered on them. And there was basically little of true meaning when it comes to taming Chinese non-market or market distorting policies. So I think that Japan is playing a smarter game because it managed to make sure that the CPTPP endured. And by that, you have a set of disciplines that provide a very different logic of regional integration to the Chinese model, with freedom of data flows, with disciplines of state-owned enterprises, things of that nature. But Japan is in a tight spot, and that's something that I tried to capture in that foreign affairs article referred to, because it is concerned about China becoming very influential in the region. I think that one of the things that Japan wants to do with its own connectivity push, the free and open in the Pacific and the Quad, is to make sure that it's not all China-centric, the direction of integration, but that they are a different set of norms and standards, and that Japan's economic competitiveness and diplomatic heft remain in the region. And that's what this connectivity push is providing Japan. But on the other hand, the United States is tightening, especially on the high-tech sectors, with restrictions that also impose a cost on Japanese companies and create an uncertainty as to where they can continue to operate in a system that has been fairly integrated. And therefore now are concerns about whether you're going to get caught in these tightening webs of export controls, in the FDI screening, the tariffs. All these things weigh on Japanese companies, and it's not easy to find the right balance or the space to make sure that you can make these very large investments and know with some degree of certainty where this is all heading.
So you mentioned two very interesting words in there, which is a digital economy and the smart strategy. And Osamu from Japan, and I'll let on, he's from the government, would like to know what your view is of what Japan's role will be in the digital era. And that's a huge word, right? Digital era, but it stretches from everything from cybersecurity, which is a trade matter, to competing for a pole position in AI technologies. But do you have a take on that?
Well, I have some thoughts. Again, it's interesting that Japan has been at the forefront in trying to codify rules for a digital economy. And when Japan was last chair of the G20, it had a very high visibility initiative, the freedom of data with trust. And I think that the intuition behind the initiative is right, and that is that we have to increase trust that privacy will be respected, that personal information will be protected. We have increased trust that as the world goes online, you're not creating undue vulnerabilities so that the critical infrastructure can be taken down. And we just in the United States have been made keenly aware of the risk by the latest wave of cyber crimes and so forth. So Japan has been very proactive on the digital economy rulemaking part of things. I think that there is an understanding that there's not going to be one regulatory regime that all countries are going to converge to, because there are philosophical differences across societies on what the boundary is on personal information and how it's handled. But I guess the goal is to try to aim for interoperability of regulatory regimes. And therefore, Japan has taken this concept to the G7, the G20, OPEC, and so forth. In the CPTPP and in the bilateral agreement that Japan has with the United States, there are digital economy rules that are considered to be ambitious. And therefore, I think that that places Japan as having an important voice in this effort. But to be quite frank, there are limits to what Japan can do. And one of the limits has to do with Japan's own digitization deficits. And that is that domestically, Japan has not been at the forefront in the transition to the digital world. That has now become, of course, a very high priority for Prime Minister Suga. And they're now, the plans are going forward to create a digital agency. But in general, that, cashless payments and all these things, when you compare the reality in many other Asian countries and what China is doing in this space, that I think puts Japan as a disadvantage as a consumer and as a generator of data. And that's going to eventually, I think, create difficulties for Japan to be at the forefront of the digital economy. So, I think that there is the awareness, and it's good to know that this has become DX, or digital transformation, is everywhere in Japan. But, it's coming with some delay, considering what other countries have managed to do in terms of reforming their own economies. And I'm sure that you've been following these, so I also welcome your thoughts, Ulrike.
Yeah, I'm actually working on this right now, so I'm fascinated with this 2025 digital cliff that METI has laid out in a report and is now being discussed. And what's exciting about that, from looking from a business perspective, is that there's this puzzle, right? That in the 80s, Japan was a front runner in IT and setting up IT systems and pushing companies into the IT world. And what's interesting about that for me is that they were the front runner, and now it's all this doom and gloom, and Japan doesn't know what they're doing, and these companies are helplessly stuck in legacy systems that are on premise. There's no shrink wrap industry in terms of software in Japan. There are these vendors that made these very complicated IT systems, one for each company. It can't be scaled. It's a real problem. It's been a problem for the last 10 years. But the 2025 cliff is exciting to me as a moment in time to follow, because these legacy systems will have run their course by then. And so here comes Japan. Maybe it's a lucky moment, if it's grabbed, where companies have to switch to new systems just when the digital transformation is happening. So it's a little bit, so if companies can catch this moment, Japan could actually sort of leapfrog and switch to a completely new system in the middle of the digital transformation, when other companies, including in the United States, are having 10-year-old systems that will then be on their way to becoming legacy systems. So we have to see, this is a dynamic thing, right? This is a development that could really work out well for Japan. But I think the role that Japan can play in all of this is to be a level-headed negotiator when it comes to global collaboration on things like cybersecurity and setting some standards and boundaries to what is okay and what's not okay. So that'll be very interesting to watch. It's unfolding as we speak, right? Mm-hmm. So we have some questions on the U.S. and Japan. So let's shift from China to Washington, and the question is really in your bailiwick, which is, has Japan's new trade orientation and this new power, follow or no more, has that been recognized in Washington? There's this World Bank just published this 2020 Global Value Chain report, and China isn't really mentioned in any of the write-ups on that, right? And likewise, the question is, Congress, the White House, elsewhere, are they recognizing the role of Japan? And if not, why not? And if so, how is it recognized, right? So has this flown below the radar because everybody is interested in China? And then, of course, the journalists, the question is a fairly long question, but I'm basically following it. The journalists and the broader national security thinkers also, do they have Japan on their radar or don't they?
Sometimes I do wonder if there's any oxygen left, because the entire conversation is about China and how should we position the United States to address the China challenge. It reminds me, it's a very different conversation, but it does remind me of the 1980s and, where everything was Japan. But I think that there is now, at least in the policy community, there is a keen awareness, it's beginning to build up, of the assets that Japan brings for the United States to have a smart Asia policy. And that's important because we don't want to just subsume everything to competition with China. That's it's a very impoverished conversation that leaves out so much of what's happening in the region. So I do think that when Japan rescued the CPTPP, heads began to turn. It did not make a complete change, but I think that I cannot tell you how many times I published, I remember very well, it was probably my therapy, but when after the 2016 presidential election, November 3rd, the results were known. The following day, I published an op-ed saying, the TPP is dead, long live the TPP, making the case that it was Japan's turn, that the American position of the TPP was over. I cannot tell you how many times I would go to meetings and people tell me, that's not going to happen. That's impossible. Japan cannot do this. And so I think that actually began to change perceptions. I also think that in the Trump years, especially in the beginning, there was not enough understanding of what it means to be left behind from regional trade agreements. And therefore, they just felt that we step out, we'll pursue these bilaterals, and will still be very effective. And the more it sunk that they actually had, that American producers were losing market share in CPTPP countries because they did not have access to those conditions, then I think it began to change that. And the notion is that other countries can move on without us. When you think about the Quad, when you think about infrastructure finance, the G7 just wrapped up their meeting, and they have these very convoluted and talk about awkward acronyms, the B3W, Build Back Better for the World. And it's a wish list for having a democratic alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative.
What was it, the B3 what?
B3W. Because
B3W, okay.
It's 3 B's, Build Back Better, and then for the world. I'm telling you, it's not a good acronym. I don't think it's going to stick. But the point being that there's an awareness that we don't have game when it comes to infrastructure investment. Who does? Japan. There is an awareness now about supply chain resilience. The Biden administration commissioned a review in critical supply chains, like semiconductors, like EV batteries, critical minerals and pharmaceuticals. The report just came out. What's interesting is that when you think about supply chain resilience, trusted networks, well, Japanese companies, South Korean companies are there. They're the ones that we should be leaning on. And when you think about trying to reduce some critical vulnerabilities vis-a-vis China, there are lessons to be learned from Japan on rare earth metals. There was that 2010 episode because of East China Sea tensions, and China imposed a non-official embargo, and Japan was shaken, and Japan took action, and it decreased its dependence on China from something like 90% to 58%. So I think that more and more, I think that there is an understanding that if you want to have, an economic strategy that's effective, that there's a lot that Japan has done ahead of us. And therefore, it is good to be collaborating, and it's good to be teaming up with Japan. And again, that's part of the whole theme of this conversation today, that Japan is not the junior partner here. Of course, if we talk about, hard security issues and, all of that, yes, of course, Japan is more limited. But when it comes to economic statecraft and the use of economic connectivity as a currency of influence in Asia, we better learn from Japan.
So Kenneth has a question that we can answer really fast. The question is, has Japan had the same issue in trade with China about theft of intellectual property as exists between the US and China? And I would say the answer is yes, which is exactly what you just said, right? That Japan has learned a lot of lessons, it has figured out a lot of ways to deal with issues of dependency and trade matters that the US can definitely learn from. So our mutual colleague Christina has a great political science question. So let me just read it. As the US Congress debates the US Innovation and Competition Act to strengthen subsidies for key technologies, and the infrastructure bill, I guess, is part of that, will Japan try something similar? It will be ironic, she says, if the US is turning to industrial policy, this is exactly my thinking, when Japan has largely abandoned these tools, right? And so Japan is talking about the market and sectoral policies rather than industrial policies and that sort of thing. So Japan's free trade leadership may now be most necessary to advance WTO talks to revise rules on subsidies. She says, right? So do you think this will be, let me say that again, Japan's free trade leadership may now be most necessary to advance WTO talks on subsidies and that sort of thing. Do you think this will be a priority for the government?
Excellent questions from Christina. I do see a great irony. When we're talking about the screening of foreign direct investment a while ago, this used to be a matter of great acrimony between the United States and Japan. And the fact that, the state was sort of being the arbiter as to who could come in or not. And Japan converged to a more liberal stand on foreign direct investment screening. And of course, now it's been asked to bring the state back in a little bit. And of course, now with the justification that this is for national security purposes, and that's a legitimate reason. But the problem is that it's not always clear cut, and state intervention in some of these decisions might be seen more with an industrial policy objective and not a pure national security objective. So I think that everybody's bringing the state back in more. Then when it comes to the nurturing of infant industries or the awarding of subsidies, the United States is thinking of very large amount of money, I think like $52 billion for the semiconductor industry. It has not been allocated, it's still being discussed, but industrial policy now enjoys bipartisan support in the US Congress. And to me, what that reminds me is a little bit of the 1980s, and when we're thinking that we need to now, again, put all this money in the semiconductor industry and so forth. So there's really nothing new, but cycles in some way. But we're going through that cycle, and Japanese policymakers are also now trying to attract Taiwanese firms to produce higher, more advanced semiconductors in Japan. And how you do that? By providing subsidies. And, I think that who will be able to throw a stone in a glass houses, right? When everybody's doing this, and how this will affect then the discussion on subsidies, and how this will affect the conversation. And obviously China is doing this at a different level and has done this for much longer. But nevertheless, I do think creates some uncomfortable conversations if everybody's going to be in the business of subsidizing what we believe are the emerging and new dominant technologies. Where are the disciplines going to be? Where is the restraint going to come from? And that's one of my concerns in this world of hard-edged interdependence, where the state now asserts itself as a larger presence in being the arbiter and invoking national security to get its way.
So I guess in just answering Christina's question, you also answered Hugh Patrick's question, which I always ask, which is what worries you most, right? And it made, in fact, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just heard you say that worries you a lot. I want to add to Hugh's question another question we had. So one, what worries you most, and the other is follow or know more is the title of our conversation. So what do you think are the three things that Japan can do to be an international power player? If you had to focus, if you had to focus and consult with the politicians and METI and friends.
Well, what worries me is, quite frankly, that Japan may go through an inward-looking moment because of the political leadership crisis, right? I mean, if we go back to a prime minister a year, or if we don't have that more decisive action from Japanese leaders at a moment where we actually need Japanese leadership the most, that combination worries me. And I hope that we don't go back to that instability at the top in the Japanese political.
Sort of a musical chair prime
yes.
ministership thing. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So that would be a concern. Now, what Japan should do, well, I think that, again, the digital transformation is essential, because that's going to define the competitiveness of these national economies. And it's very important for, especially for a society like Japan that's experiencing aging and demographic change. I also think that Japan should be very proactive with trying to expand trade groupings that at the essence are about protecting rules-based trade. And where this is, I think the WTO reform, that's above my pay grade, because it's so hard. It's a consensus organization with 160 members. There's, of course, the plurilaterals. Japan is a co-convener of the e-commerce talks, but the positions are so wide apart that it's going to be very difficult to get that going. So I actually would say grow the CPTPP. The UK is seeking accession now. That should be the beginning. And the other thing I would like to see happen is that there is a tempering of the temptation to rely too much on economic security, and therefore some dialogue among, for best practices between the United States, Japan, other G7 countries, so that, again, we don't give up who we are in trying to compete with China.
Great. So last question comes from Kelly, and it is about Japan in Asia outside China. So could you speak to the opportunities for Japan's leadership, specifically in Asia, with regard to intergovernmental cooperation, like with ASEAN, or the recent vaccine donations in Taiwan? So what's Japan's role in Asia? And that we'll use that as sort of our wrap-up question.
Well, I think that depends what part of Asia. Obviously, Northeast Asia, relations with the closest neighbors are more challenging, and I'm actually quite pessimistic about Japan-Korea relations. Despite the fact that the Biden administration would like to promote trilateral cooperation, just look at what happened just in the G7. Acrimony as to whether a meeting was planned or not between the two leaders. It did not happen, and there's no agreement as to whether they actually had made plans for that to happen. So there's a much broader set of issues, but just as in a small anecdote of how difficult it is. In Southeast Asia, I would say that Japan has tremendous assets because it has built through its economic assistance, through its infrastructure finance, long-term relations with these countries. And there's something called trust rankings, if you will. That is public opinion polls in Southeast Asian countries as to which countries you think will do the right thing. And very low trust towards China, a lot of doubts about the United States, and the one country that really is seen as a steady, constant presence, non-threatening, but a benign actor is Japan. And I think that that's a critical asset for Japanese diplomacy, that one that they probably will continue to build upon. So why don't I stop there?
Well, it's fantastic. Let me just add to that, that Southeast Asia is also where a lot of Japanese business is happening right now. Mm-hmm. So it is sort of a happy meeting of politics and economics where we really want to pay attention to what's happening in Southeast Asia and Japan. Dr. Mireya Solis, thank you so much for a great conversation. We learned a lot. There are many, many more questions that we didn't get to answer. We'll look at them later. And it was just great to have you. And please stay well. And hopefully we can soon once again do these things in person. It would be lovely to see you again and give you a big bear hug after all these years. So thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you, audience. Be back next week. We will talk about the many myths surrounding Japanese entrepreneurship and startup companies. And I will see you then. Stay well and take good care. Goodbye.
Thank you.